Welcome to the channel, English Epics. Tracy Kilkenny entered the restaurant exactly at 7, the time she had scheduled her reservation. As she walked toward the hostess stand, she scanned the tables to make sure her guest had already arrived. When she approached the table with the maitre d', she got her first close-up look at her guest in 8 years. Over the past several years, she had seen him in passing from a distance. But now that she was up close, she noticed the changes that had come over her ex-husband. Always the gentleman, Al Bentworth stood up when Tracy reached the table. She began to lean in to kiss him, but Al tensed and took a step back. A surprised expression appeared on Tracy's face, but she got the message and took her seat, as the waiter was already holding her chair. Looking into Al's gray-blue eyes, Tracy thought time had been very kind to her ex. At just over 50, the same age as his former wife, Al had a thick mane of wavy chestnut gray hair down to his shoulders, and there were barely any wrinkles on his face. He gave his ex-wife his signature crooked smile, reached across the table with his right hand, and gently squeezed her left. He noticed she was still wearing the wedding rings he had given her in another life. Al also noticed the subtle changes that the years had brought to his ex-wife. She had cut her long blonde hair into a short, stylish haircut, and a few laugh lines had appeared on her face. She looked about 15 pounds heavier than she had at the time they finalized their divorce 8 years ago, but overall, in his opinion, she was still as beautiful as she had been when he first met her over 30 years ago. After some brief small talk while their orders were being taken, Al asked the million-dollar question. "What happened, Tracy? Why did you want to see me after all these years?" Tracy took a few deep breaths before answering. "Because I want you back in my life, at least as a friend, if that's something you're open to," she said. "In addition to everything else we once had, a long time ago, we were very good friends, and I miss that part of our lives. What do you say we try again? No expectations, no conditions." "I can't promise anything, Tracy," Al replied. "But I think I'd like to try. I imagine it would be nice to sit down in a restaurant now and then with a charming friend." They had a wonderful evening and repeated it 2 weeks later. After that, they continued to meet for dinner every other week. Al had to admit to himself that he enjoyed his evenings with Tracy. Since the divorce, he had hardly dated anyone, and he found himself appreciating not only her company, but also her beauty. Al had graduated from college 6 months earlier with a degree in accounting when he and a few of his new colleagues went to a bar to celebrate the end of the work week. Since he had never been to this particular bar before, he was scanning the people and the setting when his eyes landed on the face of Tracy Valentine, one of several first-year med students also celebrating the end of the week. It may not have been love at first sight, but it was definitely lust at first sight. Al approached her table, slightly unsteady on his feet, and introduced himself. When they parted later that evening, Tracy gently kissed Al on the lips and entered her number into his phone. A little over a year later, the young accountant and the med student were married. Money was a bit tight since Tracy was still in medical school, but Al had a decent salary and was a master at budgeting. A few gifts from their parents also helped them along the way. Tracy decided to pursue medical research, and 6 years later, she had already built 2 years of a successful scientific career. When the couple got married, they agreed that the time had come to start a family. But one night, after an intense and noisy lovemaking session, Tracy quietly confessed to Al that she wasn't ready to become a mother, just Al was disappointed, but how could he argue with the woman of his dreams? He agreed to postpone it. For several years afterward, Tracy was part of a 4-person team working on dementia-related diseases. She enjoyed the collaborative aspect of her work, although, like many researchers, she noted that it was more emotionally demanding than most people realized. Every small triumph or setback felt much more significant. She often came home and spent hours telling Al about the day's events and what the team had been working on. Al would sit at the kitchen table, grinning from ear to ear, while his wife shared nearly every little detail of her day. For the past 6 months, most of Tracy's evening chatter had been about Dr. Steve Kilkenny, a member of her team who was going through what seemed to be a painful divorce after discovering his wife had been cheating on him for 12 years. Like the other members of her team, Tracy had grown close to Kilkenny, and Al liked the guy well enough on the few occasions they met. A few years older than both Al and Tracy, Kilkenny was a handsome, well-spoken man, and Tracy in particular seemed genuinely upset about his marriage falling apart. Al actually felt a bit relieved when Tracy stopped talking about Kilkenny and his domestic troubles, but he began to grow slightly concerned when she didn't mention him at all for nearly 2 weeks. Still, it was March, the busiest time of year for any accounting firm, so Al quickly pushed his worries aside as his 10 to 12-hour workdays started to pile up. The only thing Al did notice was that Tracy's workdays had also started getting longer. Once or twice a week, she too stayed late at the office, just like her husband. She explained it by saying that her team had reached several critical stages in their research. Like most people, Al and Tracy didn't have a perfect marriage, but Al would have bet money that they had a very good, maybe even excellent one. Constant communication was the key, Al believed, which is why he was so surprised when Tracy began acting distant and irritable toward him. "What's going on, baby? Did I do something wrong?" "Please, talk to me, sweetheart," Al said one evening after. Yet another minor disagreement. A couple of weeks later, Tracy informed Al that her entire team would be heading to Sweden in 2 weeks for a conference. Al didn't say much. Trips like this happened every couple of years. He thought maybe a short break was exactly what the doctor ordered for the two of them. 2 nights before she was scheduled to fly out, Tracy seemed to have softened a bit toward her husband. For the first time in 2 weeks, Tracy and Al ended up in bed, doing much more than just sleeping. After a wild night of sex that lasted until early morning, Al dragged his sleep-deprived body into the office. "Get this man a large cup of coffee," said Larry Barnwell, another accountant in the office. "Make it big enough for me to dive into," Al replied. Despite barely being able to stay on his feet, Al hummed a cheerful tune to himself all day. "My Tracy is back," he thought. 2 days later, Al dropped Tracy off at the airport, then headed into the office. April 15th was approaching. It was another long day at work. As he was preparing to leave the office shortly before 9 p.m., he realized that Tracy still hadn't called to let him know she'd arrived at the hotel. Since it was 3 a.m. in Sweden, Al figured it was too late to call, but he set an alarm on his phone for 7 a.m., Swedish time, so he could call her, knowing her conference would begin at 9. Al was still groggy when his alarm went off at 1 a.m., Eastern time, 7 a.m. in Sweden, but he eagerly dialed Tracy's number on his phone. When the call went straight to voicemail, Al assumed Tracy had forgotten to turn her phone back on after getting off the plane. Since he hadn't planned on calling the hotel directly, he had to go online to find the hotel's phone number. After confirming that the person answering the phone at the hotel's front desk spoke English, Al asked to be connected to Tracy Bentworth's room. There was about 2 minutes of silence on the line before the receptionist returned and said they had no one by that name registered. Wait, what about Steve Kilkenny, Jing Leong, or Russell Curtis? Are any of them registered there? Al practically shouted into the phone. We have Dr. Jing Leong, Dr. Russell Curtis, and Dr. and Mrs. Steve Kilkenny registered, the voice replied. Dr. and Mrs. Al repeated quietly to himself, "Thank you for the information." He hung up the phone. Al no longer felt groggy, but now he felt sick to his stomach. He considered reaching into his liquor cabinet, but instead, he went to the medicine cabinet for a packet of Alka-Seltzer. The workday hadn't officially started yet, but it was already ruined, Al thought to himself. He arrived at his office early, hoping to start the day with a clean slate. At 10, he took a coffee break and called a friend who was a family attorney. "Are you sure you don't want to wait until Tracy gets back before you start filing paperwork?" asked Robert Levinson. "I mean, you don't have any solid proof, and you haven't even spoken to your wife yet. It's a no-fault divorce. What difference does evidence make?" Al asked. "She's spending a week in Sweden, registered as his wife, after 6 months of dropping subtle hints. I wasn't born yesterday. I don't need photos or videos." We're both doing fine financially, and we don't have kids. Just split everything 50-50. She can buy out my half of the house if she wants. That place isn't home to me anymore." "You already sound pretty detached," Robert commented. "But you know the emotions will catch up to you sooner or later." "Honestly, I'm gutted, Rob, but I've had plenty of time to think it through. At one point, I actually considered jumping on the next plane to Sweden and beating them both to death. But I'm not a Power Ranger, or whatever the hell those guys are called who can kill people with a paperclip. I guess I just want to know why. If she ever loved me at all, she owes me an explanation. Hell, if she ever did love me, why didn't she at least have the decency to tell me it was over and ask for a divorce?" Tracy was the one who booked the hotel for the conference in Sweden. She saw no reason to reserve a separate room for herself, since Jing, Russell, and the project lead, Amy Carter, were all aware of the affair she was having with Steve. Jing, in particular, had told her she was jealous because Steve was such a handsome and well-put-together guy. "I tried to be respectful and wait until his divorce was finalized before making a move. But you didn't wait, you little minx," Jing said when she realized they had become a couple. "Well, we started having lunch together when he needed a shoulder to cry on. And, surprise, I must have had a pretty good shoulder," Tracy replied. "He was hurting, but he's so easy to talk to. I really started to care about him, and we have a lot in common. He's a great guy and a wonderful lover." Once they started sleeping together, Tracy and Steve began meeting 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes for extended lunches, and sometimes after work. They occasionally exchanged kisses and touches during the workday, which Russell and Amy eventually noticed, but it didn't seem to cause any issues, as the lovers didn't flaunt their relationship in front of the rest of the staff. The affair had started out rather innocently, as Steve needed a shoulder to cry on after discovering that his wife of 12 years had been cheating on him with another woman. The 4 team members were already close, and their candid conversations only brought the couple closer. Once Steve realized he was winning Tracy's heart, he began subtly drawing comparisons between his failed marriage and Tracy's, aiming to create the desired effect. Tracy, without even realizing it, slowly began to lose respect for her husband. Tracy and Steve thoroughly enjoyed their week together, so much so that Steve managed to convince Tracy to join the Pameli High Club during their overnight flight back to the United States. Knowing that her husband was planning to meet her at the airport, Tracy initially rejected Steve's advances, but the more she thought about it, the more scandalous it seemed, and Tracy realized she was going to give in. The two wrapped up their intimate rendezvous about an hour before landing, and Tracy excused herself to the restroom afterward. Jing smirked at Tracy as she returned to her seat. Tracy blushed slightly. Al opened the trunk just as Tracy was walking out of the terminal. He approached her, took her rolling suitcase, and placed it in the car. He made no attempt to kiss his wife, and she made no effort to kiss or hug him either, even though they had been apart for a week. Al wasn't sure, but as he took the suitcase from his wife, he thought she smelled faintly of recent sex. He felt like he caught that same scent a few more times on the drive home. Al was fighting a hard internal battle against the urge to say something cutting before finally muttering, "Did the conference go well?" Tracy spent the rest of the ride home entertaining Al with stories from the conference. Al pretended to listen, occasionally nodding or sighing. If Tracy had truly been paying attention to her husband, she would have noticed how white his knuckles had turned from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. When they got home, Tracy began to worry that Al might want some welcome home sex. Then she realized that aside from that one moment before her trip, they hadn't had sex in months. Worse, she noted to herself, her husband didn't seem particularly bothered by it. Al didn't stick around the house long after dropping his wife off. "I've still got half a day's work I can get done," he mumbled, as he headed for the door. On Saturday morning, Al got up early and made breakfast, bacon, eggs, and coffee. By the time Tracy finally appeared in the kitchen, the table was set, and Al was sitting, sipping his coffee. He gestured to her seat, and Tracy sat down. She began eating slowly, until Al broke the silence. So, it was so much fun being Mrs. Steve Kilkenny for a week that you couldn't even call me once. Al asked quietly. Is that how it's going to be, from now on? Tracy started choking on her food, and Al watched her impassively. Her thoughts raced back to the previous week. She was sure she had called Al when she landed. No, wait. She'd forgotten to turn her phone on for more than a day. But then again, Al hadn't left her any messages afterward. Could he really have tried calling her in Sweden? Oh God, no, she thought. Nearly 2 minutes passed before Tracy realized she was staring at the table. She knew there was no right answer to Al's questions. How long has it been going on, Tracy? Do you love him? Al asked, his voice trembling. It's been over a year, she practically whispered. She finally looked up at Al. She wasn't sure whether she should answer the second question. Do you love him, for God's sake? I don't know, Tracy stammered. It's complicated. I might feel something. But that doesn't mean I don't love you. Al ran his hands through his hair, struggling to hold back an emotional outburst. What did I do wrong? All I know is that for the past 6 months, as far as I could tell, things were going downhill, and now you're telling me you've been sleeping with someone behind my back for over a year. And you spend a week in Sweden cuddled up with that bastard, registered as Mrs. Stephen Kilkenny. Damn it. Tracy flinched as Al slapped his hand on the table. Al could see the wheels turning in her head as she debated what to say to her husband. Hell, she was arguing with herself, unsure of what had even been real in their relationship. Looking back to the beginning, Tracy realized that she had probably gotten too close to Steve while he was going through his marital problems, and she had started projecting onto Al the pain she was experiencing alongside Steve. Then, when she and Steve actually started having sex, she found it fun, thrilling, new. She was already emotionally close to Steve because he was a teammate, and those feelings only deepened as the affair continued. She still loved her husband, while also loving Steve, at least in part. The week she spent pretending to be Steve's wife in Sweden may have been the tipping point, putting Steve ahead of Al in what had become an unspoken contest for Tracy's affection. You didn't do anything wrong, Al. I still love you, but I love him too, Tracy said quietly. Arg. Al groaned incoherently, then continued. There is no you or me in my world anymore. Tracy, that I gave you every ounce of my love for over 20 years, that I forgave you when you broke your promise to have children. With me. I never looked for love or comfort outside our marriage, even though I had plenty of opportunities. And this is how you repay my love and trust. I haven't had over a year to think about this like you have, but your little getaway in Sweden gave me a full week to reflect and plan. The divorce papers will be served early next week. This is a no-fault state, Tracy. We'll split everything 50-50. You can buy out my half of the house. I want nothing to do with it anymore. Wait, I'm not sure I want a divorce. Don't I get a say in this? She asked. No. You lost that right. You chose that bastard. I'm choosing divorce. Al couldn't help but notice that Tracy didn't apologize, not for hurting him, and not for the affair. Tracy was served at work the following Monday. She came home furious. At work, Al, in front of my boss and my team, she said with disgust, throwing the papers at Al as she walked into their home. Go ahead, say something else, Tracy. They all knew about your affair. Not one of them cared about how I felt. Well, now I don't give a damn about how you feel. Tracy flushed deeply, but didn't say another word. She also didn't make dinner. Al ordered a pizza for himself. He had no idea what she ate, if anything. Al moved into a rental apartment 3 days later. Tracy bought out Al's share of the house at the time of the divorce signing. Steve moved in with Tracy a week later, even though the divorce wouldn't be final for another 53 days. The two of them got married 3 months after the divorce became official. 2 years later, Tracy and Steve divorced amicably, living with Steve every day for 2 years, bound by marriage vows and daily responsibilities. had apparently dulled the thrill of their physical relationship, and it became increasingly clear to Tracy that she and Steve had never shared the same emotional connection she once had with Al. For his part, Al dated from time to time, but never found the kind of bond he had shared with Tracy before everything fell apart. He hadn't kept track of his ex-wife after her marriage to Steve. So what happened with Steve? Al asked one evening over dinner with Tracy. "Why are you wearing the rings I gave you again?" Tracy had expected the questions to come, but still blushed when he asked them. "I really thought I loved Steve. Maybe not quite as deeply as I loved you, but at the time I believed it was enough, given the circumstances. I came to realize I was wrong. And I've come to understand that I gave up the man I truly loved, the man I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. I wear the rings to remind me of what I gave up." Later that night, Al brought Tracy to the apartment he had lived in since moving out of their home. The two made slow, passionate love, and then held each other close, just like they used to. Long ago. Tracy remembered the good times, the warmth of cuddling after sex. What she couldn't grasp was that all Al could remember were the bad times. It was morning when they both woke up. Since it was Saturday, neither of them had to go to work. Al made breakfast for both of them. When they were done, Al gently lifted Tracy from her chair and walked her to the door. She looked at him with tears in her eyes as he opened it and gave her a chaste kiss on the cheek. As she stepped out, he quietly placed his wedding ring into her hand. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.